The Wealth of Some Nations, section. Settler colonial labor and metropolitan socialism. The white nationalist ideology of Britain's workers in Australia and South Africa exerted tremendous influence on British trade unionism in the late 19th century. As Hyslop writes, beginning of long quote, "The white working classes in the pre-First World War British Empire were not composed of, nationally, discrete entities, but were bound together into an imperial working class by flows of population which traversed the world. The labor movements based on this imperial working class produced and disseminated a common ideology of white laborism. In this ideology, the element of the critique of exploitation and the element of racism were inextricably intermingled. This was an era of radical labor militancy, of profound ideological hostility to capitalism, of widespread influence of syndicalist doctrines in the unions. But these trends fused with the notion that employers were attempting to sap the organized power of white workers internationally by subjecting them to the competition of cheap Asian, and in South Africa, African, labor. This internationally constructed synthesis of militant labor and racist visions was a major cultural source of the rise of working-class racism in turn-of-the-century Britain, of the beginning of South African industrial segregation, and of the politics of the, quote, White Australia policy. These phenomena were not separate, but rather part of a single story. The political concerns of white labor were carried around the empire by persons, by newspapers, and by organizational links." End of long quote. Indeed, the largest British labor demonstration of the early 20th century occurred on the 1st of March 1914, when around 500,000 workers turned out in a 7-mile-long column in London's Hyde Park to demonstrate solidarity with 9 South African trade unionists who had been deported from their country for demanding the exclusion of black and Chinese workers from skilled jobs. Settler colonial trade unionism and metropolitan trade unionism were deeply rooted in the politics of empire. Similarly, the great majority of French socialists and the French labor movement were unambiguously colonialist, with white socialists and communists in the Algerian colony having been thoroughly infected with settler colonialism. Although the left in Britain did sometimes present positive, if patronizing, images of African and Asian people, often proffering a view emphasizing the fundamental equality of all, quote, races, of which in fact there is only one, the human race. Yet even the most anti-racist and anti-imperialist sections of British left opinion stopped far short of advocating the dismantling of the British Empire. Indeed, during the 1920s and 1930s, the Independent Labour Party was more consistent and committed in its anti-imperialism than either mainstream Labour supporters or communists. Earlier, the late Victorian British left's anti-imperialism was motivated by its anxiety about the actual and potential domestic consequences of the new imperialism, namely, quote, militarism and conscription, the swollen and parasitical state, the suppression of dissent, the growth of executive power, the weakening of party government, and the undermining of the independence of the electorate. End quote from Kirk. That the outlying left of such putative anti-imperialism couched its arguments in continued support for the rights and interests of the indigenous inhabitants of the colonies does not diminish the reality that there was virtually zero support on the left, even on its fringes, for decolonization and national self-determination for the colonies. As Kirk acknowledges, quote, the language of aggressive and unapologetic racism was most pronounced among white settler socialists, often of British origin. End quote. While not so openly racist as their white settler counterparts, British socialists not only often adopted superior, chauvinistic, and paternalistic attitudes towards colonial subjects, they frequently elaborated their derogation of the right of self-determination for colonial peoples in the evolutionary language of, quote, stages of development and higher and lower forms of civilization. Unquestionably, since the same concern was not extended so fulsomely to the inhabitants of India or Ireland, the impassioned pleading by British socialists on behalf of the natives of South Africa against the racist and exploitative depredations of the Afrikaner state in Natal was driven by opposition to its independence from the British Empire. One, quote, socialist, the prominent Fabian and Labour Party MP Sidney Olivier, who had been colonial secretary to Jamaica between 1900 and 1904, and later served as governor there for 5.5 years, ignored its well-established white supremacy and held that country up as a fine example of a successfully color, quote, blended society. While taking care not to depict the Chinese and other Asiatic people as racially inferior, even the most egalitarian British socialists nonetheless criticized the, quote, employment of the Chinese in South Africa, not upon the basis of opposition to the Chinese laborers per se, but upon their employment as cheap and forced, or unfree and slave labor, the poor and largely unwitting victims of the real culprits, the unscrupulous mine owners of the Transvaal and the imperial and colonial governments. End quote. British socialists who advocated white labor's solidarizing with non-white colonial peoples did so only insofar as doing so would not disturb the privileged position of white labor. Quote, in keeping with their class-based, inclusive philosophy, British socialists generally offered a hand of friendship to Asiatic labor on the condition that it did not pose a threat to the existing conditions and future prospects of other workers. End quote. In other words, British anti-imperialist socialists wish to avoid at all costs the proletarianization of the native populations of white settler or any other colonies. Rather, colonized societies were to be maintained in their predominantly agrarian form, with the subsistence peasantry barred from taking jobs held rightfully by white workers. Thus, although some British socialists did defend existing imperial practices, especially as against the allegedly more brutal and rapacious methods of Germany, most criticized, quote, the predatory and irresponsible imperialism of the Boer War, and the individualist and hierarchical, if more enlightened and responsible, radical liberal view of empire, on the basis of an ideal higher imperial form. British socialists in general considered existing imperialism as a method of class domination, which was increasingly racialized in character. None, however, considered imperialism in and of itself wrong, but instead aimed to place the working class, in cooperation with the colonial peoples themselves, at its head. Socialists like Keir Hardie held up 19th century Cobdenite liberalism as the ideal form of free trading and peace-loving empire. Even socialists opposed to imperialist militarism and jingoism at the time of the South African War emphasized their support for the, quote, honest, decent, and loyal British Tommy, while identifying the, quote, autocratic and bullying Prussian Goth as the main threat to world peace. End quote. In sum, concerted opposition to employers' use of non-white scab and blackleg labor against the white worker elite in Australia and South Africa was intended to bolster the class privileges enjoyed by members of all white labor unions. End of section.